Hi, in this video I'm going to talk to you about MVC at an introductory level. MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, is a software architecture that separates UI from the view. Now normally with MVC you're going to have at least three classes: the model, the view, and the controller. The model would be the data or a class that would process data. Controller is the boss, that would be a manager class that one of its primary functions is to collect the data. And then of course the view class is given the data so it can display it on the screen. Now I already have a little template in place. Notice we have our callback function on the load events. And of course here's our singleton that is a requirement for this assignment and most assignments going forward in this class. I'm going to go ahead and create the controller class first. A class controller constructor. And let's put our confirmation in here. Console log controller created. Alright, now to speed this up a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this class and paste it twice. So we have controller, we have our model, and we have our view. So we have all three classes that are required for MVC: the controller, the model, and the view. And what I want to do in the singleton is let's go ahead and instantiate the controller. So var controller equals new controller. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and what you'll log out in the console is a few things. We should have page loaded, and then next should be singleton loaded, and then start code here, but you know what, we don't need that, so I'm going to remove that. And then once we instantiate the controller, it should say controller is created. So I'm going to go to our browser and run this. Let me clear the console, go ahead and run this, and we have pages loaded, and that means the DOM is completely loaded and that callback function on a load event has occurred. The singleton was created, and the singleton instantiates a controller, and that's confirmed here by the console saying controller created. I'm going to go back to our code now and continue this. Let's go back to WebStorm. And before we move on, there's a couple of little things I want to fix. In the model class, we say controller created. Obviously, that should say model created. And the same holds true with the view. That should not say controller. That should say view. If you recall, previously we did a quick copy and paste, and I neglected to change that. And also, let's adhere to naming conventions or best practices. All class files should begin with a capital letter. So all classes begin with a capital letter. Now, one of the rules of MVC, at least in the introductory level, is that the model and the view do not communicate. There's no dependency there between the model and the view. The controller is the only object that has a reference to the model and a reference to the view. So let's go ahead and create that. So inside the constructor, I'm going to make a property this.model equals new model. This is actually some composition or aggregation taking place here. And this dot view equals new view. So our controller has a reference to the model and also a reference to the view. Now, one of the things I want the controller to do, and it's part of its job, is to gather or collect the data from the user. Now, typically this could be from a form or from some JSON object or some kind of resource. But in this example, I'm going to go ahead and hard code the data. So let's go ahead and create an array, and we'll pretend that this is the data that has been collected from the user. So let's create a little array. Let's call it grades, and make it 70, 80, 90. So again, I'm only doing this as an example. You would typically get the data from some kind of form, like I said earlier. So we just hard coded it and put in this array. Once the controller is done gathering and collecting the data, it is now time for the model to process that data. Now in this particular example, the only processing I really want done is for the model to determine the average of those grades and return that average to the controller. So what I'm going to do here is add a method in the model class, and we'll call it process. And it's going to need one argument for the data, and we'll just use a variable d for that. In the controller, let's go ahead and run that method. So this dot model dot process, and we're going to give it the grades. So what we're doing here on line 44 is running the process method in the model class and giving it grades as an argument. So that's one way to send information from one class to another, is to send it via an argument in a method. So D here becomes grades. So what do I want the process method to do? I want it to take those grades and determine the average. So what you could do at this moment is run a static method in your utility class that calculates the average, but I don't have that. So I'm just going to have to write the code again here. I'm going to create a total variable, set it to 0, and then I'm going to loop through that array, or use a for each method to accomplish that. So d dot for each, and the argument is function e and total plus equal e, and then once all the grades are added together, I want to return the average. So return total divided by d dot length, because d is an array, and I want to return by the number of elements in the array. Let's put a semicolon here. So that should pretty much do it for our process method. Let's go and test it out. What I'm going to add here in the controller is set a variable to equal the return value. So let's do result equals this dot model dot process grade. So what we're doing on line 44 is results going to equal whatever this function, whatever this method returns. And what does it return? It returns an average. Let me console log that result just to verify that everything is working. Console.log result. Let's go ahead and run it. And hopefully what logs in the console is an 80. Let me clear this, run it, and there's our 80. So it looks like everything is working so far. Before we get to the view class, I want to go back to our code and review what we have so far. In our MVC, our architecture, we have a controller, the model, and the view class. The controller class first has a reference to the model, and it also has a reference to the view. We do this by instantiating the model and the view and assign them as properties to the controller class. Notice we are not doing that in the model. A model does not have any reference to the controller, nor does it have a reference to the view. Again, we don't want that dependency there. That is one of the main rules in utilizing MVC. On line 43, we are determining what the data is. Now, typically, the controller will gather the data from some form or some kind of source. But again, this is just an example, and we are speeding up that process. So we made an array called grades, and it has 3 elements, 70, 80, 90. Once the process is done, we deliver those grades to the model for processing. It takes those grades and calculates the average and returns that average to the controller. The reason the model is returning the average back to the controller is so that the controller can forward that average to the view so it can display it appropriately. You may be thinking at this point, why can't the model just send the average to the view so it can display it on the screen? Doing so would create a dependency, meaning that everywhere the model went, this exact view would have to tag along with it. And you don't want to do that. You want this to be as scalable and reusable as possible. So the fewer the dependencies, the better. So what we need to do now is have the controller tell the view what to display. And the controller is the only class here that has a reference to the view, as you can see on line 42. So once the result is obtained, and we already console logged it to verify it, let's go ahead and tell the view to display the result. So I want to add a method to our view class, and we'll call it display. We'll have an argument. We'll call it D again for data. Now, when you do your assignment, this display method most likely won't be putting stuff in the console. You'll be populating the HTML, making it look all pretty and stuff. But for this example, I'm just going to display the result in the console. So I'll just do console log. the average grade is in D. Let me put a semicolon there. And let's go back to the controller and make sure that method is running. So after we obtain the result, we're going to run the display method that is part of the view. So this dot view dot display. What are we displaying? Not the grades, but the result. And remember, the result was done by the model. Remember, we ran that process method on the model object that returned an average. So let's go ahead and run this. Let me clear the console, run it. There's our 80, and this is what our view is doing. The average grade is 80, so everything appears to be working. The last thing I want to do is do a quick review of what we just talked about. Again, we're doing MVC, Model View Controller, at a very basic level. We have our three classes, the controller, the model, and the view. The controller is responsible for gathering the data from the user. This is where you would put all your query selectors and things like that allows you to get information from your HTML. But in this example, we hard-coded the data, and we made an array called grades and set it to 70, 80, 90. Also note that the controller is instantiating the model and it instantiates the view. The controller is the only class out of the three that has a reference to the model and the view. Notice the model class does not do any instantiation at all. It does not reference the view, and it doesn't reference the controller. And the same holds true with the view class. So once the controller is done gathering the data, that's what we're doing here, and then it sends that information to the model for processing. Once the model is done processing the data, it sends the result back to the controller, and then the controller runs a display method on the view class and sends that display method the result. That way the view knows exactly what to put on the screen. And there in the view class, when you do your assignment, this is where you're going to write all the HTML and make everything look pretty. Again, right now, the display method is only outputting stuff into the console.